Morning, everyone. So today my bird brain friend and I will be talking a lot about birds. I'm not sure if you all have heard the demented screaming earlier on. It went when the door opened. Yeah, that's a sulfur-crested cockatoo. That's also an alien. So quite related to what we're talking about today. So the two of us, our day jobs, we are in the Avian Evolution Lab. Iwei has introduced our lab earlier on, but today we are here as part of the Singapore Birds Project. So the Singapore Birds Project was started in 2016, and our main focus is to educate bird watchers and non-bird watchers in Singapore through mainly our online platform. So what you are seeing here, the GIF is working, thankfully, is our main focus of this website that we run, the Singapore Birds Project. We have a species page for every species of bird in Singapore. And in these species pages, we have dedicated information about how to identify them, very beautiful pictures, some basic information about their ecology, their biology, and other things like where to find them, if they're rare species, where we can look for them, when we can look for them, things like that. So the project started around 2016, and a bunch of us joined around 2020. The team expanded to about 17, and since then, we've been organizing a bunch of walks, booths, talks. So this is one of our first conferences, actually. Thank you so much for inviting us. It's quite nervous for us, but so far I'm doing okay, I think. So apart from our booths and walks, we also have a records committee. So we have a team of 8 people who arbitrate records of rare species in Singapore. What we do is to assess whether the identification is correct, whether we think a species is a wild bird or not. And these information are uploaded on our database, which we launched 2 years ago. It was also featured in Straits Times. So that was quite a big thing for us. In our database, what you need to do is just to type in the species of interest. The font is a bit small, but what we have is a list of all the accepted species, accepted records in Singapore. And for each of them, we include information like photographs and if we think it's wild or not, why we think it's wild or not. We have our rationale included there, links to various sources about these records. So these are some of the places where we invest our efforts in. So enough about Singapore Birds Project. Let's talk more about the birds, the main feature of our talk. Currently, our checklist, we have about 428 species, but more than half of them are actually migrants. So these birds don't breed here. They come here during the migratory period around September to around April, May. The birds, some of them are still in Singapore, but they're slowly flying north right now. And of our checklist, about 184 of them are residents. So these are birds that we know are breeding here. These include non-native species. So they don't include the things like the cockatoos that were screaming earlier on. Those are not breeding here, but a bunch of other species that we'll be talking about today. Right now, there are 2 species being voted on, the white-crowned hornbill and the striped-throated bobo. If you all have been up to date, the white-crowned hornbill was found in Ubin about 2 weeks ago. It's been featured all over Mothership, Straits Times. Not sure if you have seen the news articles. About 200 people are flocking to Ubin to chase this one bird. I don't know why. I do that too. So, yeah, of the 428 species in Singapore's checklist, a lot of them were actually not here about 200 years ago when Singapore was in its, so to speak, original state. In fact, a lot of these birds are dead, or in more scientific terms, locally extirpated. Many of these changes are due to landscape changes as well as the introduction of many other species, which is the focus of our talk today. So for the purpose of today's talk, what we want to do is to introduce a few terms, and we want to talk about these birds in terms of 3 different categories. Definitely introduced birds. These are species that would definitely not have made it here if not for human transportation. Those that are self-introduced. So these are birds that were not necessarily here about 200 years ago, but made their way here due to various landscape changes and other impacts like that. And those where it's kind of complicated. So you can go both ways. Yeah, maybe it's native, maybe it's not. There's a lot of story behind each of them. So we won't be able to talk about all the species here today because of our time limit, but we'll be introducing some prominent ones. So the first one, Javan Miner. If you have not seen this species before, you are not paying attention when you're walking around. Or you could be a Zoom audience and maybe you're overseas, haven't been here before. Welcome to Singapore. So, as the name suggests, this species is native to Java. It's actually endemic there. But they are now in Singapore, which is somewhere here. It's a little bit smaller than the label. They were brought in about 100 years ago because of the pet trade. So the pet trade was much larger in Singapore compared to what it is now, at least for birds. And when the first birds arrived around 1920s, 1930s, they didn't really establish themselves. But after the Second World War, they started establishing themselves more. They became self-sustaining, and now they're all over. They're the most common species in Singapore. We generally see them in urban areas. We don't really see them that much in the central catchment yet, perhaps because of their preference for open area. But because the Malay Peninsula is now pretty much an open area compared to what it used to be in the past, where it was more forested, they've been actually spreading quite a lot. So there have been populations that were introduced to KL, to Ipoh, other places as well. But the main bulk of birds in the Malay Peninsula are from Singapore. So although Singapore is quite small, unfortunately, the impact of this introduction is quite massive. The second bird that we're talking about is the house crow. This species, if you have not seen them walking around, I don't blame you. So the house crow is also not from here. It's native to India, some parts of Burma. They were brought in as perhaps pets we don't fully understand, and maybe they also came in through ship-assisted means. So when ships came to Singapore as due to trade, they might have invaded Singapore through the ports. And now they are kind of all over Singapore, but actually there have been quite a few efforts to try to control their population, and the numbers might be decreasing in Singapore, but the population in Johor is still doing quite well. So even if we, try to get rid of the birds in Singapore, they will still just fly back. So I've talked about two definitely introduced species. These ones are pretty straightforward. We know a lot about their history because of the extensive literature that has gone in. But there are some species that are a little bit more complicated, and those are the ones that Movin will be talking about.
Thanks, Keita, for giving me the more interesting part of the presentation to talk about. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk through some of the other two categories, the self-introduced species, as well as the ones where it's complicated. So the first one is the Asian quail. So all of you in Singapore have been woken up by this bird at some point. The bird that is super loud and keeps going whoo, 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 in the early morning, and just won't let you sleep in on the weekends. So what is maybe a bit depressing for all of you to hear is that actually a long time ago, this bird was only recorded as a very rare migrant, so you would not have heard it that often. But since, so this bird is actually a nest parasite. So what it means is that it actually lays eggs in the nest of, it outsources childcare, basically. It gets house crows to take care of its babies. So it lays the eggs in the nest of the house crows, kicks out the eggs, and then the crows have no idea they're raising a quail, raises its own, it leaves the family, finds another crow nest to parasitize later on. So before the introduction of the house crow, it never had a host in Singapore. So it would only come in occasionally as a rare migrant. But once the house crow started establishing itself, the records of quails, like juvenile quails, and like the population as a whole just started booming, basically. There was a huge spike in the quail population in the 80s, and things have never been quite the same. The next one, this one is actually pretty interesting. So the red bottle lapwing is actually a kind of shorebird that lives in grasslands. Typically, the Thai Malay Peninsula, that means anywhere south from the Isthmus of Kra, never really had much grassland habitat. It was mainly all forested. So for a bird that prefers open habitat, that was the limit, right? There were sporadic records from the 19th century, but the bird is now a common resident breeder from 2003. Habitat destruction has been happening through the Thai, across the Thai Malay Peninsula for a while now, and it seems to be one of those birds or one of those animals that's actually benefited a lot from the destruction of the forest. Opening up the habitat in the grasslands have created a whole swathe a whole corridor of suitable habitat for the bird. And so it's basically come down all the way from Thailand, where it used to be, south through the peninsula and into, oh, this is a map, basically tracing the first records of this bird over time. So previously, the range of the bird was the yellow colored map, like up to the top of Malaysia, actually, like yeah. And then over time, it has actually come throughout the entire Malay Peninsula until we had our first breeding record of the bird in 2003 in Singapore. And since then, it's actually been sighted in the Riau Islands as well, which is a bunch of islands that are just south of Singapore that are politically part of Indonesia. So this bird is actually continuing to expand its range, and who knows, even though like there was a unconfirmed like a record of the bird from Java in 1925. For all we know, it may actually get there at some point in just by natural distribution. And now the last example that we have for the self-introduced category is the gray-headed fish eagle. So this bird was first recorded in 1949. There was a first breeding record very soon after 1950. So the two birds in the photo are actually different species. This is where the entire audience is just going to be looking at us bird people going like, what? It's the same photo. No, they're different birds, I swear. The lesser fish eagle on the bottom has an entirely dark tail and has a different habitat preference and was actually native to Singapore historically before it got extirpated. So the lesser fish eagle has a preference for forested water bodies. So it likes medium-sized rivers that have good mature forest on the side. The gray-headed fish eagle prefers much larger water bodies. It's not so particular about the vegetation that surrounds it, actually. So you can find it in like larger mangrove deltas, estuaries, larger rivers, floodplains. This kind of habitat never really existed in Singapore historically. But what has changed is the establishment of like these very large reservoirs. And as these reservoirs mature, you get big trees next to them, you get large fish introduced to them, as I'm sure some of the other presentations, SPW's presentation spoke about, right? Like, you know, when you introduce fish, a lot of them are cichlids, a lot of them are carps, they're big fish. They're great food for the gray-headed fish eagle. And eventually it established itself, and it established itself here. And this bird is particularly interesting because it's not the most common bird in many of the other countries, but it's got an especially dense population in Singapore. So if you want to see this bird, this is one of the best places to come in and look for it, actually, even though just about 70 years ago, it wasn't even around. But if you go to its natural habitats in the peninsula and parts of Indonesia, it's quite a scarce bird. Yep. And now we get to where it's complicated. The Blacknaped Oriole is a bird that everyone should be familiar with because it lives even in HDB estates in Singapore. It's this big, not big, medium-sized yellow bird with an interesting call. It's ubiquitous, found throughout the island, and you'd think that it has been here forever. That's not true. Historically, it was a migrant that only came in during the winter months, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated because the migrant is not the same bird that is here now. The migrant is actually a bird from Indochina, from southern China, that flew down into these areas to winter and then goes back to breed. And that is the subspecies diffusus, which recent genetic data has shown to actually probably warrant being considered a separate species, the Chinese Blacknaped Oriole. And the bird that we have here now, the resident, is actually maculatus, which is the Sunda Blacknaped Oriole. And this bird was never here before. But what we suspect is that there is a mixed origin of birds on the island. There were some escapees in the 1940s, and there were also natural, like birds that naturally moved over from like some of the islands in Sumatra. This bird is not a bird that lives in pristine forest. It likes a slightly broken up parkland type habitat, which is just perfect in Singapore because we tried greening up the whole island, right? So the origin of the birds here are mixed, which means there's some natural movement, some natural self-introduction, but there's also probably a good deal of escapees in the initial waves of introduction. And what is very interesting about this is that since the Sunda Blacknaped Oriole has established in Singapore, we've seen a marked decline in the number of migrants. So kind of established this based on the fact that museum specimens from like back in the day were mainly just the migrants. You don't see the Sunda birds at all. But in more recent years, you barely see the migrants. You only see the Sunda birds. The birds, the adult birds are actually quite similar. The main difference being that diffusus, the migrant, has a lot of yellow in its wings, whereas our birds, the Sunda birds, have a lot of black wings. The juveniles are much more distinctive. the juvenile migrant have an entirely white breast with black stipples on it. So that really does stand out. And we still do get a few individuals of that type every year, but definitely not the same numbers that they got before. So is this, correlation? Is it correlation or causation? We really don't know. But it's just an interesting thing to think about. Another thing is the pied Imperial pigeon. So this is a black and white pigeon. You should see it on campus actually in NUS. It's a small island and coastal specialist, historically never found more than 3 kilometers from the coast on the main island of Singapore. But now they're all over the place. In part, it could be because of habitat destruction, habitat change that has opened up a lot of the interior parts of Singapore to more resemble coastal habitats. But the numbers are really massive. And inland occurrence is probably also in part because of the free-flying birds from the Jurong Bird Park that sort of just escaped decades ago and just mixed with some of the birds of genuine wild origin. So there is some proportion of mixing, and so it's a little bit more complicated. Should it have been here? Yeah, definitely. But should it have been here in this abundance? Probably not. And then this last case is white arm shama, which is a particularly interesting thing because it is native to Singapore. It was poached off completely from the main island of Singapore, and we have genetic data to support the fact that the entire population in the central forest now are entirely comprised of escapee birds that are not from here. But the birds on Pulau Ubin, which is nationally part of Singapore, has its native population intact. So in this case, we have like this sort of bizarre situation where the birds on the main island of Singapore, their provenance we know is not from here, but the ones that we have in Ubin are definitely native birds. So that does have a case of like, when we're doing like status or we're thinking about how we manage these populations, what we do, right? It raises a couple of questions. Do we manage the birds in Singapore separately from the ones in Ubin? Do they consider them completely different populations? The ones in Singapore, the ones in the forest in Singapore, are definitely filling the niche of the members of the same species that have been removed, but they're not technically native. So how do we manage them? So the kind of key takeaways that we wanted everyone to sort of think about from this talk is that the idea of native versus non-native isn't always clear-cut. Birds are traded so often, birds can move so easily. What does it really mean? And what does it really mean for the species in these sort of blurred categories, especially in cases where it's self-introduced or where it's really complicated? In many cases, they fill in niches that some of the other populations, these extinct populations fill. They are filling up a purpose. We don't think that they're always, like having negative impacts on other species. But what does it mean in terms of management, in terms of how we think about them? And also, do we privilege certain categories over others? Because no one, to my knowledge, is going to say the great-headed fish eagle is bad in Singapore, right? It came in 1950s, but at this point, we consider it part of our native avifauna. That's definitely not the same for the Javan Miner, even though the Javan Miner did finally establish itself about that same period as well. So does geographic proximity matter? Does the agency of the bird, like did it bring itself over or did we bring it over? That really matters. And what about species with an ambiguous provenance in Singapore that are highly threatened elsewhere? I mean, the Javan Miner is an example, almost like highly threatened in Java, but even other birds, like for example, say let's think about the straw-headed bulbul, a songbird that is critically endangered globally. Singapore is its last stronghold. Could be that some of the birds on the main island of Singapore are not even from here, could be escapees from the pet trade. But does it even matter given that the bird is so highly threatened throughout its range, right? Would it mean that, would we be so particular that, any birds that show genes or alleles of birds from, say, Borneo or something need to be removed from the population? Or should we just say, hey, actually, you know what, the population's really small, it'd be good to have some more diversity here. So there are a lot of these different considerations to think about, and a lot of different ways to think about what being native and being non-native means and the implications it has for management and also how we just sort of appreciate the birds around us. Okay, thank you very much.